Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast, Season 9, The Origins of Architecture. Chapter 1, Before Buildings. This season is called The Origins of Architecture. Over the next 10 episodes, we will explore architecture not as the history of famous buildings, monuments, or professional designers, but as one of humanity's earliest attempts to shape its relationship with the world consciously. Long before architecture became a discipline, a profession, or even a named concept, human beings were already modifying environments, creating shelters, organizing space, and constructing forms of collective life. This season, therefore, does not begin with architecture in its institutional sense, but with the deeper question that precedes it. At what moment did humans begin to transform space intentionally rather than merely occupy it? Across the season, we will move from survival to settlement, from settlement to ritual, from ritual to public life, and from public life to the earliest forms of collective spatial thinking. Because before architecture became an object of design, it was first a condition of existence. The origins of architecture are therefore not limited to monuments or cities, but connected to the much earlier emergence of spatial awareness itself. To understand architecture in this way is to study not only buildings, but the gradual transformation of human life through space. Architecture is often discussed through the language of buildings. Histories of architecture are typically organized around monuments, cities, styles, and named architects, creating the impression that architecture begins only when structures become formally recognizable or aesthetically sophisticated. Within this framework, earlier human environments are frequently treated as primitive preconditions rather than architectural realities in themselves. Caves, temporary shelters, hunting camps, and improvised enclosures are usually described as backgrounds to architecture rather than as part of its origins. As a result, architecture becomes narrowly associated with permanence, construction, and visual form, while the broader question of how humans first began shaping space remains insufficiently examined. This limitation arises in part from how architecture has historically defined itself. The discipline often privileges intentional composition, technical refinement, and symbolic representation, qualities more easily identified in temples, palaces, or monumental settlements than in fragile and temporary environments. Yet this perspective risks reducing architecture to the finished building rather than understanding it as a spatial condition produced through human action. When architecture is approached only through completed structures, the long complex transition that precedes them begins to disappear from view. However, the origins of architecture cannot be reduced to the origins of buildings alone. Before walls were stabilized through masonry, before cities emerged, and before architectural professions existed, humans were already engaged in spatial modification. A branch leaning against a rock face to protect from the wind, a fire positioned at the center of a gathering space, or an animal's skin stretched to regulate exposure to the climate may appear insignificant from the perspective of architectural history, yet each represents an intentional intervention into the environment. These actions transform nature into an inhabited space. In this sense, architecture begins not with monumentality, but with the conscious organization of human experience within space. This distinction is important because occupation alone does not necessarily produce architecture. Many species inhabit environments, construct nests, burrows, or colonies, and develop spatial adaptations. Humans, however, differ in their ability to attach symbolic, social, and cultural meanings to these environments. Space gradually became more than physical protection. It became connected to memory, ritual, cooperation, identity, and collective behavior. The shelter ceased to function merely as a biological necessity and slowly evolved into a cultural condition. Architecture, therefore, emerged not simply because humans needed protection, but because human life itself became increasingly organized through spatial relationships. At this point, the relationship between architecture and survival also becomes more complex. Early environments were certainly shaped by immediate needs such as climate, safety, and resource management. Yet even the most basic settlements reveal evidence of social organization extending beyond pure survival. The placement of hearths, the separation between activities, the emergence of shared gathering spaces, and the repeated use of certain locations all suggest that humans were beginning to structure everyday life spatially. Space was no longer accidental, it was becoming intentional. This transition also marks an important conceptual shift in how humans relate to nature. In earlier conditions, survival depended largely on adapting directly to environmental forces. Humans sought caves, trees, shadows, and naturally protected areas because these spaces already contained defensive qualities. Over time, however, humans increasingly began producing these qualities themselves. Protection no longer depended entirely on discovering suitable environments. It became possible to construct them artificially. This transformation represents one of the deepest foundations of architecture because it signals the moment when humans ceased merely responding to environments and began actively reshaping them. At the same time, these early spatial interventions should not be understood through modern assumptions of architectural authorship. There were no architects in the contemporary sense, no professional distinction between designer and builder, and no separation between construction and everyday life. Early architecture was collective, adaptive, and deeply embedded within communal experience. Knowledge emerged gradually through repetition, experimentation, and environmental observation rather than through formal theory. Materials were not selected based solely on aesthetic preference, but on climate, geography, availability, and accumulated practical knowledge. This is why the origins of architecture are inseparable from those of vernacular thinking. Long before architecture became formalized, humans were already learning how to negotiate climate, terrain, and material conditions through spatial adaptation. Earth, stone, timber, reeds, animal skins, and eventually mud brick were not merely construction materials, but mediators between the human body and the environment. Early shelters, therefore, represent more than technical achievements. They reveal the beginnings of environmental intelligence. In this sense, the first architectural decisions were fundamentally ecological. Architecture emerged not only from the desire to build, but from the necessity of negotiating environmental conditions through space. Such environments also challenge the dominance of visual thinking within architectural discourse. Contemporary architecture is often communicated through images, drawings, and representations that privilege appearance over habitation. Yet the earliest architectural spaces were experienced primarily through exposure, temperature, darkness, proximity, movement, smell, and sound, rather than visual composition alone. Their importance lay less in how they appeared and more in how effectively they mediated between the body and the surrounding world. Architecture at its origin was experiential before it became representational. Once this perspective is adopted, architecture begins to appear not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual accumulation of spatial consciousness. The transition from temporary shelter to organized settlement did not occur instantly, nor did a single technological breakthrough drive it. Instead, it emerged through countless small acts of environmental modification repeated across generations. Architecture, therefore, developed not through isolated genius, but through collective adaptation and shared experience. Its origins are distributed across human behavior itself. This also complicates the traditional boundary between nature and architecture. Early human environments often existed somewhere between the natural and the constructed. A cave modified with fire, stone arrangements, or protective additions was neither entirely natural nor entirely artificial. Likewise, temporary camps and primitive enclosures occupied an unstable threshold between landscape and architecture. These hybrid conditions remind us that architecture did not emerge outside nature, but from continuous interaction with it. Understanding this interaction changes how we define architectural beginnings. The question is no longer, what was the first building, but rather, when did humans begin intentionally producing spatial conditions? This shift may appear subtle, yet it transforms architecture from a history of objects into a history of relationships between humans, environments, and collective life. The origins of architecture, therefore, lie not only in construction, but in the emergence of spatial awareness itself. To study architecture in this way is also to reconsider what it means to inhabit the world. Space is never neutral, because every environment shapes behavior, movement, interaction, and perception. Even the earliest shelters carried social consequences, determining who gathered together, who remained outside, and how collective life was organized. Architecture did not simply emerge from civilization, it actively participated in the formation of civilization itself. In the next chapter, we will move from temporary occupation to permanent settlement. We will examine how the transition from mobility to staying transformed human relationships with land, resources, time, and social organization. The discussion will shift from shelter to settlement, from movement to permanence, and from immediate survival to long-term spatial continuity. Because once humans began remaining in one place, architecture was no longer simply about protection from the environment. It became a framework through which entire ways of life could emerge. This concludes Chapter 1 of The Origins of Architecture, Before Buildings. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.